magiliw, pelas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituing at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
We wish to enter into silence and fill the silence with prayer. O one God of all nations, you created the earth and the cosmos in their differences, beauty and frailty. The diversity of cultures and religions seek you, the origin of all things. You want all to be for each other, not a threat, but a blessing. Our one world should be, by your will, a peaceful and habitable home. You created us all in your own image and likeness. We are your image. In all those that seek you in truth, you have inspired hunger and thirst for justice and a desire for peace. Awaken in all the religions and in the peoples of today that they should be instruments and messengers of a better, more loving world. Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone. May I welcome you to the Security, Food Availability, Sustainability, and Access webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars on the policy and governance of food system. The webinar is organized by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Philippines, the Ateneo de Manila University, the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, the Xavier University, Ateneo de Manila University, Ateneo de Cagayan University, the Xavier Science Foundation, and the Ateneo de Davao University. Thank you all for joining this webinar. I am Randy Tuanyo, the Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, and I am pleased to moderate the webinar this afternoon. Before we start, let me give you a short introduction of the webinar series and this webinar this afternoon. The Philippines has had an undernutrition prevalence of 14.7% from 2017 to 2019, which has been exacerbated by the economic lockdowns during the COVID pandemic. The recent inflationary prices of basic food items have resulted in further increasing the number of hungry Filipinos. Undernutrition has also caused a very high rate of child stunting, placing the country in the top 10 countries worldwide. Thus, in the mid-2020, the working group on SDG2 Zero Hunger started out as an informal gathering of food security advocates who are faculty members and administrative staff of the Ateneo de Manila University, Xavier University, and the Ateneo de Davao, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Since that time, the working group has been organizing webinars on various themes and topics related to food systems, shifting from a narrow focus only on single sectors related to hunger, such as agriculture, health, nutrition, environment towards a systems thinking approach for far-reaching analysis and understanding of the complexity and interconnectedness of our food problems and challenges. Consequently, more comprehensive and sustainable solutions to the ever-growing challenge of hunger and malnutrition can be identified and addressed. Furthermore, the working group has been mindful to ensure that the voices of representatives from the basic sectors, farmers, indigenous peoples, women, students, and the youth are actively heard in these webinars. So as of end of 2022, a total of 17 webinars have been organized with the overall aim of raising the consciousness and awareness of faculty, staff, and students of the different Ateneos and schools and institutions linked with SDSN all over the country, using a food systems framework and approach to the problems of hunger, malnutrition, access and availability of food, the effects of climate change and the environment on food production, food sovereignty, sustainability, food safety, waste, and others. For the series of webinars in 2023, the working group has identified the overall framework of policy and governance regarding 5 critical subject areas: securing food and availability, sustainability, and access, which we are having this afternoon; nutrition, health, wash, and food safety, which will be held after this webinar; social protection and safety nets in July; land, water resources in September; and food waste and the environment in November. Each webinar will start with a presentation by a representative from the academe on the current state of the particular subject, followed by other academic and government representatives on legislative policy or governance issues in this area. As in previous webinars, representatives from the basic sectors, NGOs, CSOs, consumer organizations, youth, and students will serve as reactors to the different presenters. For this webinar, we deemed that a discussion on the availability, sustainability, and access of food would have to be undertaken, which seeks to explore the role of policy and governance in addressing issues related to agriculture production, food security, and nutrition, in uncovering insights and sharing experiences and perspectives related to access of food and food availability in the light of rising food prices, and how to develop sustainability in food and agriculture and nutrition in order to feed our country. We have invited a series of experts that would be able to assist us in the discussions this afternoon. And let me introduce them one by one by their order of their presentation. First, we have our accomplished academician, Dr. Fermin Adriano, scholar, writer, and policy advisor to key government officials. He once served as the information director of the UP system and vice chancellor of UP Los Baños, where he took an early retirement with the rank of professor. He was board member of the former Manila Chronicle, while at the same time serving as its editorial consultant and regular columnist. He writes a weekly column for the Manila Times. He had published a number of scholarly books and articles on Mindanao development issues, the Bangsamoro peace and conflict concerns, rural development, agriculture, and agrarian reform, and was policy advisor to several secretaries of agriculture, secretary of agrarian reform, and successive presidential assistants for Mindanao. He used to be a member of the Southern Philippines Development Authority and serve as the advisory council of the Asian Development Bank. Our next speaker, let me introduce them one by one before they make their presentations. Our next speaker is Dr. Shelito Habito, who is a professor of economics at the Ateneo de Manila University, where he's also senior fellow of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. He's also chairman of the consultancy think tank Brain Trust and Operation Compassion Philippines, where he writes a weekly op-ed column, No Free Lunch, in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, now in the 20th year. In 1992 to 1998, he served as the cabinet of former President Fidel V. Ramos as Secretary of Socio-Economic Planning, heading the National Economic and Development Authority. Before joining government, he was professor and chair at the Department of Economics at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He also worked at various donor agencies and educational institutions, World Bank, Harvard University, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto University, and the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. And has been tapped by various donor agencies to advise them, and also the government of the Philippines and also the countries in Asia, Pacific, and Latin America. Currently, he is the chair of the governing board of the Jakarta-based Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, or RIA, and is a member of the Board of Governors of the Management Association of the Philippines, the Board of Trustees of the Ramon Magsaysay Award Foundation, the JICA Philippines Advisory Committee, and the World Bank Philippines CSO Advisory Group. He is also editor-in-chief of the Asian Journal of Agriculture and Development, and also is involved with the Knights of Columbus, Kalimpok Foundation, Clean Air Asia, and Learning Communities, Organizations of Peace. Our last but not the least presenter is Mr. Judas Guerra, who is the policy consultant at the Office of Senator Risa Ontiveros. He served as Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for Popular Democracy, a non-government organization that conducts research to support policy advocacy and capacity building programs. And he also served as the Deputy Director General and Undersecretary of the National Anti-Poverty Commission, a government agency that coordinates poverty reduction programs being undertaken by the national and local governments and ensures that the marginalized sectors participate in government decision-making process. Yusek Esguerra also served as consultant to various government and donor agencies such as the Department of Transportation and the International Labor Organization. So for this afternoon, let us listen first to Dr. Adriano, who will speak on an overview of the situation in terms of agriculture and food, and also provide some recommendations on the governance of food systems. Dr. Min.
Thank you very much, Dean Tuanyo, for the generous introductions. May we have the slides. And good afternoon to everybody, to all those who are listening and participating in this important event that talk about agriculture. Agriculture is the flavor of the month of the country right now. As Dr. Shell Abitor mentioned in his column, there's so many op-eds, column opinion writers talking about agriculture, simply because that we are having problems with our high food prices. My presentation will be a quick one. It's about 50 slides minus the title page. So I'm going to be quick in terms of showing some of the slides because of constraints in time. Can we go to the next page, please? So the outline of my presentation is quite simple. What is the problem? Ano ba yung problema? Effects of the problem, resulta ng problema, and then causes of the problem. That's the third portion. And then my recommendations. Next slide, please. So the problem, we are academicians, so we always want to be clear as to the problem that we are trying to address. And the problem is that the underdevelopment and underperformance of the Philippine agriculture sector. That's the problem we are currently encountering with regards to our agricultural sector. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what are the causes of the problem? I think we jump here. First is that one of the major problems that we have is that our it's called AFF, Agricultural Fisheries and Forestry and Fisheries sector, grew timidly, only at 2.5 from 2001 to 2021, and it has registered the lowest growth rate among the three major sectors that we have: the service sector, industry sector, and AFF, as you can notice. Next slide, please. So because of the slow growth of the agricultural sector, its contribution to the growth rate of the GDP actually from the period 2001 to 2021 is only 3%. And at the same time, the share of the agricultural sector is declining through the years. I remember that it way back in the 1980s, about 25-24%. Now it's less than to 10%. Compared that to our population growth rate of 1.5%, that means that we're not producing enough to be able to feed our people because our growth rate is only 0.3% compared to our population growth rate of about 1.5%. Next slide, please. I think, yeah. Next slide, please. Despite the small contribution of the agricultural sector to the economy, it's still a major or important sector because 24% of our labor force is employed in the agricultural sector. And as mentioned by, also again in his column by Dr. Abito, its spread is throughout the country because the service sector is mainly focused on 3 regions in the country, NCR, Region 3, and Region 4A. But agricultural sector is spread all over the Philippines or the different regions of the country. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, because of the low productivity of agricultural sector, it can be attributed to the low labor productivity of the Philippine agricultural sector. So if you compare labor productivity of our agricultural sector compared to service and industry, you'll find out that it performs quite low. And if you compare our agri-food exports to other countries, again, the Philippines lands at the bottom rung of the table compared to Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Next slide, please. Well, in economics, we measure the productivity of the country through what we call total factor productivity. And in this case, again, the Philippines is lagging behind the ASEAN countries, as you will see from this slide. I will not elaborate anymore, but I hope that the coordinator of this workshop will be able to share to you our slide so that we can show to you that all of the things that we are saying here are based on empirical evidence, and you can review them by yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, so it basically tells the same story that our harvest or yield farm is quite low, relatively low compared to other ASEAN countries in the region. Next slide, please. So if you focus on a certain commodities like local swine production or hog production, you will see that our cost is much higher because of low productivity than other countries. For instance, for chicken, our cost of production is about 112 compared to the highest, in the second highest in the region, which is China, about 107. But compared to Thailand, we are really above the price that Thai offers to their consumers. In the same fashion, our cost of production for chicken, the right side of the slide, is much higher than our ASEAN neighbors. Next slide, please. So, what are the effects of having low productivity and underperforming agricultural sectors? The results are basically 3. Low wages, mababa yung sweldo sa mga manggagawa sa sakahan, and then of course because of low wages, high poverty incidence. Second, I think we are feeling this now. There's soaring domestic food prices because of low productivity and therefore short supply of different commodities. And as a result, because they're unaffordable to many of the Filipino consumers, there is high malnutrition rates or incidence in the Philippines. Let me show the empirical evidence in the subsequent slides. So if you look at the basic pay for the sector, that's the left-hand side of your slide, the agricultural sector offers the lowest wages among the 3 major sectors of the economy. On the right-hand side of the slide, you will see that poverty incidence in the rural areas or agricultural sector is highest in the country. In fact, 2 out of 3 poor Filipinos in the Philippines, in the country, reside in the countryside or agricultural areas. Next slide, please. So the laggard development of the agricultural sector also led to high domestic food prices. We tried to measure the contribution of just one commodity in the consumer price index called food and non-alcoholic beverages from 2000 to 2021. And what is this contribution? There are about 11, if I'm not mistaken, items when you're measuring your consumer price index. And one, as I said, is what is referred to as food and non-alcoholic beverages. And this group actually contributed out of the 11, 43% of our inflation, annual average every year, to our total inflation. And that's really the one driving our inflation. And this is nothing new, no? As I said, lately, I think they will come out with the new inflation figure, but last month it was 8.7. The contribution of that food and non-alcoholic beverages is almost 50% of our aggregate or total inflation. So it is the one driving high or pushing upward our inflation rate from not only last year but throughout from 2000 to 2020 to 2021. Next slide, please. Well, this is just a summary of the commodity items under the food and non-alcoholic beverages, which are contributing to our food inflation figure. Okay. So it was fish before, meat, rice, corn. Of course, recently, if you look at it, it's sugar, onion, etc., etc. Okay, next slide, please. Unfortunately, the poorest of the poor spends, if you look at this aggregate expenditure of the poorest of the poor Filipinos, they practically spend 60% of their income already on food. And despite spending 60% of their income on food, they still go hungry. It is really ironic, if not tragic. So high domestic food prices contribute to high incidence of malnutrition, which remains elevated as of 2019, actually worsened during the pandemic. Next slide, please. In fact, as a recent study by the World Food Program shows that even if 70% of the income of the poorest of the poor are spent on food, it will not be, they cannot still afford nutritious diet. And therefore, and this is particularly true to the poor consumers. And that's the reason why, because these items are quite expensive, they tend to underconsume meat, vegetables, dairy, and eggs. There's so much consumption of rice, and because of the uneven, there's no protein content to, only a little protein content to rice. This leads to significantly higher malnutrition rates among our poor people. Next slide, please. As a result of these high food prices and high malnutrition incidence in the country, this resulted in the prevalence of stunting and malnutrition death rates in the Philippines. And it's really scandalously high. And if you look at this graph, particularly on the right-hand side, malnutrition in the Philippines is sky high compared to Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. 5.75. Thailand is 0.64, Malaysia 0.28, and Vietnam 0.2. Okay, so the prevalence of stunting among kids between 0 to 5 is about 29%. Next slide, please. So, malnutrition, unfortunately for us, imposes large human, economic, and social costs. It's reflected, it manifests in terms of the poor learning capacity of our students, the lower productivity of our workers, loss of income for our adults, high health costs, and eventually slow economic growth if you combine those factors together, which eventually perpetuates poverty in the Philippines. Next slide, please. So what are the causes of the problem? I think you will be interested. Ano ba yung dahilan why the low productivity and performance? Okay. I will make it faster. So there are 5 causes of the problem. One is self-sufficiency. I will probably not go to each of the slides anymore. Second is the permanent protection policies. Third is the rice-centric budget. Fourth is the limited economies of scale due to land fragmentation. And 5 is that there is a need to reform the DA institutions. On self-sufficiency, can we just go through quickly? Because of the focus on self-sufficiency, I think we have focused on the production side of the agricultural endeavor. there is no emphasis in terms, particularly on the cereal side. There is no emphasis on the value chain, and there is no emphasis in terms of ensuring nutritious and quality food, and therefore food security for the country. Next slide, please. So if you so we equated food self-sufficiency with food security, which is not true, because food security means availability or accessibility of nutritious and safe food and affordable food to our people. Next slide, please. Okay, part of it, because of the production orientation, there's so much focus on giving production support services like fertilizer, seeds, etc., which only lasts for the cropping season when they're going to use. It will not last forever, and therefore you just have to keep on permanently providing the subsidy or yung subsidiya o yung tulong. It would be better if it has been invested in public goods like farm, process, post-harvest facilities, etc. Next slide, please. So this just shows you that because of the focus on the production side, there is no emphasis on the downstream development of the value chain, etc. Among the different commodities, there is no processing, development of new products from a certain commodities. Next slide, please. So here previously I was talking about public goods. You can see that just in terms of logistical costs, warehouse capacity, we don't have, and we experienced that particularly during the onion problem recently, the past several months. Yeah. Next, please. Okay, because of that weak value chain approach, we lost so much in terms of post-harvest losses, 30-40%, and the fish about 20%. Next, please. So I've said it already. I think there should be a shift towards provision of public goods because it's more permanent, longer lasting in terms of its positive impact. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. We don't need that anymore. I've said that. And, we don't invest in, we talk about climate change, etc., but there is no specific budget for climate resiliency in the Department of Agriculture. There are no permanent staff working on climate resiliency in the Department of Agriculture. All are job orders or contractuals. Next, please. So most of the, again, in terms of research, most of the funding are on rice rather than on, and nothing neglect of the other commodities. Next, please. Same thing. Can we go to the next one, please? So the second one is permanent protection these policies. I think you should not. I think lest I be misunderstood. I'm not against protectionism per se. I'm against protectionism that is not time bound. Okay, we can protect particular commodities, but let's put a time horizon so that we will be able to encourage efficiency in the production of that particular commodity. As they said, if you're in business and you cannot make money in that business after being protected for 10, 15, 20 years, in fact, 40 years now, you should not be in that business anymore because consumers will suffer. And that is what's happening. The extension of this protection for almost half a century has made our agriculture inefficient and uncompetitive. Next slide, please. So this is the same story. The protection is increasing to agriculture compared to the manufacturing sector. Next slide, please. I think it's self-explanatory. Next slide, please. The third one is the over-concentration of our budget on rice. In fact, 50% of the budget of the Department of Agriculture is spent on rice to the neglect of other commodities. So when you're asking, why is other commodities like onion not developing, not salt not developing? Because we put our money to rice alone. And then for the 2023 budget, we found out that it will increase by another 20%. So 70% of the budget of the Department of Agriculture will be spent on rice productivity and rice support services. Next slide, please. So it's the same story, in other words, it's just you have a family of 5 people. You sent one of your kids to Ateneo, but you cannot afford, sending all your kids to Ateneo. So you spent, you have to send your other school to public schools. And we know that some of the public schools, educational quality is bad. So this is what's happening. We put so much on rice with nothing for other commodities. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I will not, let's just go. So this slide just shows to you that, the major contributor to the agricultural gross value added are actually non-rice commodities. It's livestock, poultry, and corn. But we're under-investing in it. In other words, if you're in a business, your tendency is to put your money where you can have more, generate more income, isn't it? But here, it's not. We are investing in a commodity that's not providing us with so much return compared to the other commodities in the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. Okay. I think it's the same thing, that's the one I was telling you about. Next slide. So not even on the number of workers, and not even, next slide please, the budget is based on comparative advantage. And next slide please, not based on next slide, not the last one please, on this one. There's another one, poverty incidence. Okay, so if you look at poverty incidence, the highest concentrations are in the crops of corn, coconut, forestry, agricultural sector. Growing rice is, I think at the bottom right. That means that the poorest tillers are not in the rice sector, but it gets the bulk of the expenditure of the department, and not on those who are tilling the crops, where concentration of the poorest of the poor are. Next slide, please, number 4. Well, I will not go that. So limited economies of scale. I think because of the protracted implementation of agrarian reform, our lands have been fragmented or divided into minuscule sizes. Average farm size now is about less than a hectare. Next slide, please. Next slide. Because of that, for example, in corn, the average farm size is about 0.54 per hectare, and therefore you cannot enjoy economies of scale in the production anymore. And unfortunately, literature are showing that the bigger the land size, the higher the productivity. There is such thing as economically viable land size. Unfortunately, because of the ceiling of 3 hectares imposed by agrarian reform, you cannot own lands that will provide you viable economic enterprise, agricultural enterprise. That's a problem. And because of the succession, or it's being bequeathed to the next sons or daughters or something like that, the land has been transformed into minuscule sizes, which cannot enjoy economies of scale because you cannot put in technology, you cannot afford technology, capital, etc., etc. It's a major problem. 5, the last one is about the institution, the DA institutional problem. I think the problem with the DA is that it's focused so much on regulation rather than the development. So all its pronouncements are so focused on regulating entry of imports, etc., but not on the development. For example, on the fishery sector, there's so much struggle or debates about whether we should import fish or something like that. But there is no discussion on how are we going to promote the development of our aquaculture and mariculture, because the focus is on regulation rather than development. Next slide. And if, in fact, even the budget is allocated that way. So, and if you look at the disbursement, there's another problem. The absorptive capacity of the Department of Agriculture is quite low. Next slide, please. So 65%. So if it's given 100 billion, it can only spend about 65 to 70 billion of that budget allotted for the department. On top of the fact that mababa na, the budget is already low, and yet it's not all of them, all of the budget is not spent within that year because of the lack of the the weakness in the absorptive capacity of the bureaucracy of the organization. Next slide, please. So this is just telling you that when there's a new administration, the absorptive capacity of the agency goes down actually instead of increasing. So we're going to feel that now because of the transition to the Marcos administration. Lastly, yep. So yeah, go ahead. Oh, so and there are just a couple of more slides for the recommendations. One I categorize as urgent because of the high level of malnutrition happening, the high food inflation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Couple one. I think we need to, because we are in a crisis situation, and we need now to stabilize the supply so that we can stabilize or reduce the prices of prime commodities. And therefore, since this is an emergency, unusual situation because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, because of ASF, because of the bird flu incidents, I think we need to ease a little bit on the tariff rates right now because of the fact to make the food more affordable to the Filipino people so that we can reduce the prices. The second recommendation is that if we're so concerned about rice, I think we need to talk to our ASEAN neighbors. Mainly, they are the ones, 90% of our rice imports come from Vietnam, partly in Thailand, to have an agreement with them to supply us if we ever have a crisis or or a shortage in rice, to supply us the necessary rice that we need. I think based on a cooperative agreement that can be undertaken. Third, we need to seek bilateral agreements actively, even talking to Russia to be able to address this fertilizer shortage. We need to look for commodities like wheat, the animal feed, the wheat, because it's so important in terms of the feed requirements of our livestock, poultry, and fishery industries. Because we cannot bring down the final price of pork, chicken, or fish because of the high cost of feeds. By the way, 50 to 60% of the production costs of your hog is feed, 60 to 70% for chicken, and then 70% for fisheries constitute basically your feed. And then for those who will be affected by the liberalization of tariff or the reductions, we should be able to extend the provision of unconditional cash based on the farmers already identified in the farmers registry, which was already done by the Department of Agriculture. Final slide, please. Over the long term, I think we need to do 6 things. First is that we need to reform the DA institution. The DA is an institution. I think we need to appoint, or the president has to appoint a full-time secretary, so that because the job requires a 24/7 attention, and that person should be technically competent while politically savvy. We need to capacitate the DA central staff, because their role now is really basically because of the local government code, because of the decentralization, to support the LGUs. The mandate of the LGUs is to provide the basic services, part of which is agriculture. The next one is really we need to seriously look at the comprehensive agrarian reform program. Increase the land ceiling ownership so that we can, those who want to farm can buy lands. Those who do not want to farm, many of them do not want to farm because they have been sending their kids to universities so that they will get out of agriculture, can sell their lands. So if we can increase it by 20, 25, 32 hectares or something like that, that would give us an economically viable land size to work on. And increase the land ceiling ownership, to paradigm shift, increase expenditure on food on public goods. I think we need to promote crop diversification, including the rice sector, so that they will be earning money from other high-value crops. And the last one is the gradual opening of the agricultural sector for to trade. Thank you very much. Sorry it took some time.
Sige, thank you, Dr. Bean. I think that this was actually a very comprehensive overview of the agriculture sector in the issue of food sustainability. You tackled also the causes and also some recommended measures that can be undertaken. So I think in terms of institutional change, I think you recommended some institutional reforms, and our next speaker, Dr. Shell Habito, will be also speaking on this topic. So, Dr. Shell.
Okay, thank you. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Let me go right ahead and share my own screen and share my perspectives on this issue on food security in the Philippines. Let me split my talk into, sorry. Essentially 4 major parts. Again, I can breeze through the first parts. Dr. Fermin has already addressed them, but I'd like to talk about, again, the interlinked crisis, which is already alluded to also by Dr. Adriano. And then I'd like to perhaps spend the last slides on new directions, I guess following through from what Dr. Fermin has actually talked about. But again, we've probably heard it said already because of so much discussions on the topic. The official definition of food security, according to the United Nations FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Food Summit in the late 90s, is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And if you parse that, there's 3 parts to this. Availability and affordability are important aspects of that. Too many people forget about the affordability and are thinking only of supply, domestic supply and domestic production. Adequacy, food safety, and nutrition. Again, quality of the food is very important apart from quantity. And of course, in the end, it's all centered on human well-being, an active and healthy life. Now, the FAO elaborates that further, but the Economist Intelligence Unit came up with this Global Food Security Index to actually assess countries around the world. I think there have been about 113 or so countries that have been rated according to this. And again, 4 sub-indices have been developed. Again, one on affordability, which again is just the ability of consumers to purchase food. So prices and incomes are very important there. Availability is the sufficiency of food, either domestically produced or imported. And then risk of supply disruptions are considered. National capacity to expand farm output is part of the assessment. Then quality and safety, again, this is the variety and nutritional quality of the average diets of the people and the safety of the food available. And the newest introduction to the group of indices, sub-indices, is sustainability and adaptability, which measures exposure to impacts of climate change, susceptibility to natural resource risks, and the country's adaptive capacity to these risks. How are we doing? Well, vis-a-vis our neighbors, especially the ASEAN countries, we are actually only better than Laos and Myanmar as far as affordability is concerned. In other words, food is really inordinately less accessible to Filipinos, especially the poor, compared to our neighboring countries. If we look at the overall rank, we're number 67, and we're only above Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Note, by the way, that Cambodia has a higher rating on affordability in food than we have. Oh, by the way, maybe you should have a look at the last column, which is the incidence of stunting, but I'll make an allusion to that later on. As already mentioned, we have among the highest incidences of child stunting in the Philippines. I'll return to that. Now, again, this distinction between food security and food self-sufficiency, which are not one and the same thing. And too many people seem to think they are. No? First, let me give you 2 pictures of 2 very different countries. The Philippines, which has ample domestic food supply and largely self-sufficient, meaning we're more than 80–90% sufficient in most key foods. But the food prices are high, imports are strongly regulated, average incomes are low, and as a result, there's weak access to adequate food, especially among the poor. And we have 1 out of 3, essentially, of our children 5 years old and below who are severely malnourished as to be stunted. It is a situation where we are nearly food self-sufficient, but not food secure. Now, The contrast is Singapore, which has very little domestic food production because it doesn't have the land and natural resources. But it has low prices of mostly imported food. There's unrestricted trade. There's high average incomes because of a bustling economy. Food is widely available and accessible. And of course, not surprisingly, their stunting is just 2.8% of their 5-year-olds and below. It is far from food self-sufficient, but it is ranked among the most food secure countries in the world. So what this all tells us is food self-sufficiency is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for food security, which is really our end goal. In other words, a country can be food secure without being food self-sufficient, or it can be food self-sufficient and yet not food secure. So we have to take a closer look. And of course, self-sufficiency in itself is okay. It's a good objective to aspire for. But as mentioned by Fermin earlier, we have to look at how we are trying to get that self-sufficiency. And Dr. Briones, in a 2016 work, essentially offered two contrasting ways. And these are the extremes of going for self-sufficiency. The first one, which I call the supportive or nurturing mode, provides meaningful, effective support to producers to pwede tayong makipagpantayan sa mga tinuruan natin ng agriculture, yan, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, na dito nag-aral nga yung mga expert nila, di ba? So this approach does not make the good more expensive. And in fact, it can make it even cheaper with the right types of support. The other approach is what I call the protective approach, wherein you try to block imports. You have quantitative restrictions, high tariffs, and even sometimes government direct control or total control, which we did for rice for decades. Now, the ban or the quota on imports limits the domestic supply and has the effect, of course, of pushing price up because of the law of supply and demand. The higher price, obviously, will reduce demand, but it will induce more supply. And so that is what will make the supply and demand meet. And so you eliminate the shortage, we attain self-sufficiency, but it will be coming at a high price, where consumers pay a much higher price than in the supportive mode. Now, our problem is that we had pursued self-sufficiency via the protection route more dominantly. And this is what led, ironically, to food insecurity. The rice prices progressively moved away from border prices over time. And this graph dramatically shows that at the time when government trade protection shifted from favoring manufacturing to favoring agriculture, and this is the 1990s onwards, the spread between domestic prices of rice and border prices widened and widened. Of course, except for that anomalous period in the 2008 crisis, where we were even responsible for that worldwide increase in the price of rice. Now, by the way, all of that reflects rising inefficiency and falling competitiveness through time, because there's a bigger spread between our domestic costs and therefore domestic prices and the border prices or international prices. Now, again, two comparisons, the Philippines and the Malaysian rice industry. In the Philippines, we all know we have time and again been pursuing 100% self-sufficiency as a policy. And in fact, we all know that it's often said that the mark of a good Secretary of Agriculture is if he can attain self-sufficiency, even the mark of a good president. And that's why they keep promising that. So rice consistently dominates the agriculture, productivity enhancing things, which are called public goods like irrigation, farm-to-market roads, post-harvest facilities, and so on. Now, we also keep even marginal lands in rice production because we want to maximize production. Rice kept rising over time. Now, contrast Malaysia, which since the 1960s has only consciously targeted only a minimum 65% self-sufficiency. And this is embodied in the 1st to the 10th Malaysia plans, their equivalent of our PDP. The Malaysians know that they can actually do 100%, but the government felt it wiser to use arable lands for industrial crops to raise farm incomes more. And that's why they have rich farmers, actually. Well, I will spare you the anecdote that I had when I was there in my first visit in the, I think, 1980s. Long story short, when we asked a farmer what his biggest problem was, he said his car was 5 years old. and was too old and needed replacement. So ito sa ating pangarap lang yung magkakotse para sa mga magsasaka natin, di ba? But anyway, the government especially gave focused support to rice production and productivity. And the reason for that was that more of the rice farmers are the Bumiputra or the native Malays, for which the government had a direct bias, especially in past decades. But the other important ingredient is that the government closely watched rice prices abroad, and they deliberately kept the gap between domestic price and the border price constant. And you can see that in this graph that I got from a PhD thesis of a Malaysian, and how it was actually almost constant through many years. Yung sa atin, it's very volatile, just like Indonesia, by the way. And then on the average, as a general trend, pataas ng pataas ang presyo sa atin domestically. So again, this movement progressed over time. And the problem with that is rice is our priority staple food. So the first thing that any family, poor or rich, will spend money for food on is rice. And for the poor, as already indicated by Dr. Min earlier, pag naubos na yung budget mo sa rice pa lang dahil napakamahal, wala ka ng pambili ng ulam, ng proteins and vegetables. And that is what leads to the stunting and severe malnutrition we're talking about. So it pushes a large segment of the population into food insecurity and malnutrition. And there's a great irony there. Our constant pursuit of rice under 5 is stunted, and I like to describe them as damage for life. Why? We all know that brain development happens 90% before age 5. The only part of brain development that happens beyond age 5 is just the remaining 10 hours that by age 5 he or she is stunted. Talagang ano na siya. He will grow up to be a lower productivity person because of brain or physical impairment. Now, the problem will be a long-term problem. In fact, we're already feeling it all this time because our stunting in the 1980s was almost 50%, 45% as of 1989. And look at the brain scans of a well-nourished and a stunted child. The gray matter, which is very important for cognitive ability, intellect, and memory, is so much less in a stunted 5-year-old. So that is what wreaks long-term student assessment, where third-year high school students in the different countries participating were assessed for reading, science, and math aptitude. And I have to zoom in on the bottom part of this table to show you how Philippines is bottom dweller in reading, and maybe some consolation in the fact that we're not the bottom, but second to the bottom, to the Dominican Republic, that is. But we all know that malnutrition traces fundamentally to poverty and the high cost of food in our country. And so I'd like to say, ultimately solving our education crisis rests on the shoulders of the DA and of the LGUs, who are responsible also for agriculture, as much as that of the Department of Education. And by the way, a lot of people like school feeding programs. Remember, that's too late. That's beyond the 5 years that you wanted to catch early on. But it's useful only in the sense that at least if you don't have hungry children in the classroom, they can concentrate more on their teacher. But what if their cognitive ability is already compromised by prior stunting? So that is our problem. So I offer some new directions here. First, and this has already been mentioned by Fermin, is our overly excessive trade policy, excessively protectionist trade policy. Competition in general pushes productivity and widens the choices of consumers, and it curbs profiteering because nobody can profiteer if there's somebody else who can always offer a lower price. But trade controls curb this kind of competition, and it kills the impetus for productivity improvement and for reducing costs. And of course, it raises prices in general. Now, here's the myth. Too often we hear that unbridled liberalization supposedly killed agriculture or kept Philippine agriculture underdeveloped. The reality is, as I said earlier, it was in the 1990s when the bias of protection shifted to agriculture. And why? How did that happen even with the WTO? Because we consistently filed for waivers, exemptions on sensitive lists, and exceptionally high tariff rates on so-called sensitive products, and this bridled agricultural trade. So saying that we had unbridled liberalization for farm products is the exact opposite. What is the result of all of that? Well, we had complacency on the part of both government and of course, and then low productivity, uncompetitiveness, and food insecurity as the impacts that we are seeing today. What's the fix? Well, we have to have a calibrated use of tariff policy, not trade control, quantitative restrictions, or outright regulation, because tariffs are more transparent instruments of trade policy. So if we say we have a 35% tariff on rice, what we are really saying is that you control from the agriculture sector, especially on RCEP, leading to a flooding of our markets with the imported goods, is misplaced because nothing changed in the terms of protection for our. And then there's a lot of bilateral free trade agreements that also can be pursued. And did you know that the Philippines has the least number of such preferential trading agreements in the ASEAN? We only have 10, where the rest of our neighbors either have 15 up to 27 of these free trade agreements. They have been much more aggressive and opportunistic, while we have always been defeatist and defensive about these trade agreements. So we have to ensure active and fair competition in our domestic markets, and we have price when you have really this kind of more liberal trade environment. But of course, our own self-inflicted problem, because we can no longer blame Russia, Ukraine for all this, because while the others have felt that and saw that in their inflation rates, ours have been much higher than our neighbors. Second major direction, what I call provincialize agriculture in the Philippines. Now, I've already said agriculture is the backbone of the Philippine economy. Dr. also mentioned that earlier, and this is the graphic reason why. If you look at the services sector, only 2 regions already account for more than 1/2 of total GDP coming from services. Industry, you just add another one, Central Luzon. But if you look at agriculture, fishery, and forestry, you have at least 6 regions contributing half. And you can see how the pie, the buko pie, is evenly spread. So anyway, in short, what we see here is a sector that transcends and connects all our regions together. That's why I call it the backbone. Now, devolution in agriculture was a good idea, but it was badly executed. Municipal agricultural officers were left to their own devices, and many of them were being used as drivers by the mayors because the mayors didn't even have a prior code. Centralized and top-down governance of agriculture continued. And I have a quick story about Barangay Lopero in Zamboanga del Norte, where I and the team at the Rural Poverty went to, just to get a good view on the ground. And having been a government official in the past, I like to ask this question. If there's one thing that the government will grant you, what will you ask? And the barangay captain, who was a farmer, was telling me, carabaos. And I could understand why. They had a lot of grasslands up in that denuded plateau, but they could not plant because they didn't have any means to till the soil. So I asked, what do you get from the government? He said, fertilizers and hybrid seeds. So I was surprised. So what do you do with the fertilizer and hybrid seeds? He said, well, we don't have any use for them. That young lady, but she's now, it's already also been mentioned, agriculture is under budgeted compared to our ASEAN peers. We have less than 2% of our total budget going to agriculture. Our neighbors have anywhere from 3 to 7% going to agriculture. But our problem is, no matter how we shout our throats dry for higher budget to DA, they can't get it because they can't even demonstrate the capacity to spend it and spend it properly. And so the problem is how to improve DA's absorptive capacity. And this is where my provincialization comes in. So what's the fix? Work with and through the provincial LGUs by downloading funds to them from the DA budget via matching grants. And these matching grants will challenge them to use their mandanas funds and their regular era for agriculture. If you tell them, for every 1 peso you put in agriculture, DA will download to you 1, 2, 3, even up to 5 pesos per peso. Para lang ma-incentivize sila na gamitin. Parang ang naging attitude ba nila is, bahala sila sa buhay nila. Devolved na eh. But no, it was supposed to be their responsibility to capacitate the local governments to manage agriculture well. So anyway, one thing that has been piloted under the Duterte administration and being scaled up is this province-led agriculture and fisheries extension system, PAFES. And I'm part of a group from Los Baños that has been pushing vigorously on this mode of agricultural devolution. Make the provinces responsible, let them coordinate the municipalities on agricultural programs, and let the DA constantly capacitate them and provide a budget for it, and make it part of DA's key result areas that they will be assessed by the DBM on. Well, in short, agri-performance is the shared accountability of the Department of Agriculture and the provincial and municipal LGUs. And I'm also suggesting if we have an EDCOM, a multi-sectoral approach to plotting our way forward in education, perhaps maybe we should also convene an AGCOM or AgriCom so that we can all put our heads together and chart the course for the way forward for agri. So finally, other new directions would be, I'm not taking too long, but again, I won't go into each of these, but Peru essentially cut the chain between farmers and users and end users. They put up people's restaurants that serve subsidized meals from farmers' produce. Food banks collect this food waste and excess food from the neighborhoods on weekends. Hunger by 2030. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rochelle. I mean, that's another excellent presentation. And also you gave an overview of what, well, self-sufficiency is not actually equal to food security. So I think that's a misnomer. And I think you also excellently linked this issue of food insecurity and malnutrition, stunting, and poor education, and also illustrated some directions that our agricultural sector can undertake. So for their last presentation, we have Jude Pesquera. Jude.
Okay, thank you for those presentations. I actually anticipated very encyclopedic presentations from our two experts. No, so I decided to focus on micro level challenges that are related to the recent tumult in food prices and supplies. Next slide. And I hope to stay within my time. Okay, this would be about crop insurance, cold storage, and a very current issue, the government-assisted cartelization in the trading of certain commodities. Next slide. So let's begin with the seguro, the crop insurance. This is related to the recent increase in inflation because vegetable prices did rise significantly, including onion prices, after I think 3 typhoons and torrential rains submerged many areas. And a PIDS study as well as a World Bank study more recently tell us that given the crop insurance system in the country today, you would need to triple the government budget to have an adequate coverage of the small farmers in terms of their ability to be compensated when their standing crops are damaged. And the idea there is if you have crop insurance, you can take risks to plant again, even after your crops have been decimated. I watch a video of onion farmers in Nueva Ecija who say that they decided to just work on hollow blocks for the local construction industry after their standing crops have been flooded twice. If there were crop insurance, that would not be the case, and supplies would be more reliable. At present, we have several problems in crop insurance that the president, if he were present at the DA, problems include things like only half of the losses are compensated. It is rice-centric. And then even large farmers and high-value crop producers receive the subsidy from government. And finally, that until today, the PCIC still does not use the index-based insurance system, which would afford them a greater reach. So these are the problems with crop insurance. And if we had a better crop insurance system And if we had the private sector also involved in providing insurance for those that can afford commercial crop insurance, then notwithstanding the calamities that before us, we would be in a better place. Next slide. So we would like to have so this is one solution concepts, and fisher folk groups are also arguing for it, no? In places where the winds have become stronger due to climate change, they are arguing that there should be more crop insurance. Using weather index-based compensation of farmers. Yung no need to go to the field and to inspect. Basta sobrang lakas ng hangin, hindi ka nakalaot, dapat may crop insurance payout. Kung bumaha sa area mo, no need to examine the damage, may crop insurance. Kung walang clouds sa area mo for 2 months, dapat may crop insurance. That's an index-based insurance system. Sayang, wala ang presidente doon sa opisina niya. So these recommendations, many of them from the World Bank and PIDS, are not being acted on. Next. We go to cold storage. No, this is just a snapshot of what the cold storage system should look like, and typically there is an international comparison where the Philippines fares very badly in terms of cubic feet of cold storage per. Slide would give us some of the information in terms of country comparisons. Next, please. So there's a Global Cold Chain Alliance Study 2018 report, and it shows that the Philippines has only 0.037 cubic meters or 1.3 cubic feet of cold storage per urban resident. India has much higher cold storage capacity, as well as South Korea. And Vietnam has more than 3 times our cold storage capacity for agriculture produce. So that's the starting point. Next slide, please. What we hear about cold storage, meron daw cartel, no? And but my own thinking is that there may be other reasons for the shortage of for the undersupply of cold storage. Farmers don't have access to cold storage also because there is not enough cold storage facility, not just because a certain trader has preempted the limited availability of the limited supply of cold storage space. Some people ask, maybe the market failure is in terms of credit. No, at harvest time, the small farmers don't have cash, and so they can't pay in advance the cold storage fees that the cold storage service providers are asking for. Maybe there's a chicken and egg problem. There's no cold storage facility because there's not enough crops around that would make the facility commercially viable. But maybe there are not enough crops around because there is no cold storage facility. So maybe there is a coordination problem there that needs to be addressed. There are other possible hypotheses, but moving on to the next slide, we see the government going directly to the provision of a few cold storage here, a few there. In the case of onion, in Nueva Ecija, and then there are also plans to set up cold storage facilities in Mindoro. Okay, but it is really not obvious that government provision is the way to go. In India, for example, in places where agricultural produce is thin, the government goes into a PPP type of arrangement where 50% of the risk equity is shared by government. And then later on, or maybe the government is a junior equity partner. So if the cold storage facility goes bankrupt, the private equity provider has first dibs on the remaining assets of the cold storage facility. So, so this is a market failure looking for the right solution. This is the direct provision by government is a response that does not begin with a clear analysis of what the cost of under provision might be. So for instance, if there is a warehouse receipt system, as sort of a microfinance arrangement, maybe that is a solution for half of the places where there are entrepreneurs thinking of expanding their cold storage facilities. Pag meron kasing microfinance, may pambayad ang mga tao on the strength of the commodities that they're, on the strength of the value of their commodities that they're harvesting. And in that situation, the farmers will be able not just to reduce post-harvest losses, they will also be able to exercise the choice of either selling or storing. Because right now, the choice is not available to them. Okay. I'm thinking that if we do have more cold storage facilities, then maybe that is also a key to the diversification of our farm production. Like fruits and vegetables, they need cold storage so that they can be sold further away and over a longer period of time. The cold storage facility is like a time machine. During harvest time, sabay-sabay ang harvest, no? Bagsak ang presyo ng mangga o ng vegetables. But, and so that is a disincentive to production next year. But if you have cold storage, then you don't need to sell at a loss. Okay. And the following year, that could encourage diversification into more perishables instead of just rice. Okay. So in addition to the allocation of budgets outside of rice, then maybe cold storage is a critical investment that we need to increase production in non-rice commodities, including fish. Next slide. And this is a very current topic. We always hear the word cartel, no? Cartel in sugar, cartel in fish trading, cartel in onions. But maybe it's important to say first that it's not easy to put together a cartel that will corner the supplies, meaning the imports, the harvests, and the inventories. It's not easy to do that. They say that in the case of onions, talagang binabuy up ng agents dati ng cartel yung produce sa Nueva Ecija, and then they allow this cornered produce to rot so that the cartel queen, the onion queen, is the only one who would have the bulk of the supplies. No? So it's not easy, and sometimes it can be very, very expensive to secure this supplies. And then ideally, if you want to go into the cartel business, there should not be too many cartel members. Because the moment you work together initially to restrict the supply, no, itago yung supply, and so the price goes up, there is always a temptation in the interim for some cartel members to defect, to take advantage of the high price and sell secretly para kumita siya. So that's a very big temptation, which makes putting together a cartel difficult. And then there should be ways of disciplining the defectors. Yun nga yung mga nagbenta secretly. And the argument here, the hypothesis here, is that government bureaucrats have had to assist cartels where they do exist in securing the supplies, in ensuring that there are not too many members in a cartel, and also in threatening the defectors. Sige, next year, hindi kayo makakakuha ng import allocation. No? That kind of threat. And the government, the next slide would show, does have the instruments for assisting the formation of cartels. We don't mention it here, pero the current headlines about the sugar industry are exactly a kind of cartel formation where the government legally, some say illegally, chose only 3 importers who could corner sugar supplies, including industrial grade sugar that Coca-Cola Alaska uses, and which is not produced domestically. So the bureaucrats have mechanisms for helping the cartels corner the supply, enforce the rules, and discipline defectors. The first ones are the sanitary and phytosanitary clearances. Ordinarily, these are not supposed to be used to manage imports. They're just used to make sure that pests do not come in into the country, and that the meat or the vegetables are not toxic with pesticides. No, but today, for example, even in the case of rice, where imports are supposed to be restricted only because there is a tariff that is set for rice that's trying to enter, Undersecretary Sombilia inadvertently revealed that even for rice, the provision of clearances by the beer plant industry becomes a tool that the DA currently uses to allow more or prevent the entry of too much rice into the country. So the SPSIC, or the sanitary and phytosanitary clearances, are being used. The other ones are the certificates of necessity to import. And in the case of fish, CNI is needed. In the case also of sugar, a supply and demand gap has to be estimated before the volumes are determined. But overall, these 2 instruments, the SPSIC and certificates of necessity to import, are being used to decide how much will be imported, who will be allowed to import a little or a lot of supplies, when the import will come in, and how they will be distributed in the market. That's in the case of fish and sugar imports. So these mechanisms become available to bureaucrats, for example, in excluding others from importing. And in today's headlines, only 3 importers were chosen. And in the case today, the sugar planters are saying that the importation of 440,000 metric tons by just 3 importers is really unprecedented. Ordinarily, government regulation and bureaucracies should not have that power, because the WTO rules would say that we should not have restrictions on the volume of imports using these non-tariff barriers. Going on to my last slide.
Can we just wrap up? Sorry, Secretary, maybe you can wrap up already.
So in ordinary times, both SRA and the NFARM-C would be importing decent levels of produce. But this day, ibig sabihin, democratically distributed yung rents from buying cheap imported produce and selling it at high domestic market cost. But these days, the game is being changed. And if you look at the headlines, that's what you would see, no? Hindi na democratic din ang sharing ng rents from buying cheap and selling high domestically. That would be my last slide. Thank you. And I stuck to my time.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you for actually pinpointing some of the microeconomic issues now that also needs to be focused now in the agriculture sector. So at this point, let me introduce now the to the actors that we have. Who will actually give a few points for reflection after the three main presentations. So the actor is actually Crystal Norris Ras, who is a third-year student at the Xavier University, Ateneo de Cagayan, studying the Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. She's a consistent Dean's Lister and the Vice President of the Ateneo Crop Science Society and the College of Agriculture Commission on Student Rights and Welfare. She actively also advocates for student rights and believes in the philosophy of agriculture as a way of life. Our second reactor is from the farmer sector. Karen Isidirio is the Policy and Advocacy Officer of the Pambansang Kilusan ng Samaang Magsasaka, National Organization of Farmers and Fisher Folk Organizations in the country. Has participated in various technical and policy fora and consultations of the national government on farmers and fisher folk issues and sat in national regional networks such as the Asian Farmers Alliance. So let's first have the reaction from Crystal. You have 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, I'm Crystal Norris, a student from Xavier University, Ateneo de Cagayan. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on behalf of the student sector. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the speakers for their insightful talk, which further widened my knowledge regarding the topic. So from the past years of studying agriculture as a course and being immersed in the sector from the point of view of my family, from a small-time farmer, it's a sad reality that the Philippine agriculture sector is really underdeveloped and underperformed. Apart from the mentioned reasons by the speaker, Sir Fermin, I believe that there is also a connection between the interests of the youth in terms of the productivity level. So as a student myself, I really noticed how most of my peers stay away from this occupation and course with the mindset of farming or agriculture as something very strenuous, the need for physical labor and having below average wages. And it's safe to say that they think it's not interesting enough compared to other professions. And from the point of view of my family, having this occupation, we really have a hard time making ends meet, trying to keep up with the trends in prices, skills, trying to adjust to modern agriculture practices, and especially capital support. Apart from that problem, as farmers and producers, we still have to worry about the quality of food produced. It's a reality as mentioned by our speakers, that we are not producing enough nutritious food to feed our people. Food security has been part of my studies as an agriculture student. We focus on improvements on producing not only on the increase of quantity of food, but also on the quality, as mentioned by Sir Silieto. With food security ultimately having connection regarding our health problem, which is also connected with the status on our Philippine education and our youth's ability to read and write. Food is very vital in terms of development. And with low quality of food, the children cannot meet the standard nutrition for a healthy development, which is paired with a devolution in agriculture, which is considered a good idea but badly executed. And yes, I agree with the action to provincialize agriculture development. Agriculture, as mentioned, is considered to be a backbone of the Philippine economy. But in some cases, I would like to say not all, but there are local governments that has low priority of agriculture and not developing the potential of the land and the manpower. So they're more on focusing on other means of development. Although I won't say that it's wrong, but we have these underutilized resources. Why can't we focus on this type of development? It's a good idea to provincialize agriculture through provincial LGUs by matching grants, as mentioned by Sir Celieto. And I'd also like to note that in some areas, according to farmers I have interviewed, there is a lack of presence in government programs, especially in dissemination of information from the DA to the farmer. So that's it. Thank you very much. I truly learned a lot, and I look forward to the improvement in our sector as a budding professional. And I sincerely hope that the youth and the students would take on the challenge of becoming the force of change that we really need. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, for highlighting again the youth support for agriculture and also for agreeing with the recommendations made by our main speakers. Let's go now to Karine. Cecilia, Karine, mention. Hello, Karine. Narinig ba tayo? Ako pa, parang
narinig ako. Hello?
Parang medyo
Narinig po ba ako?
Karine.
Narinig niyo po ako?
Parang mabagal lang
Parang
konti.
hindi. Sige, narinig niyo po ako?
Medyo mas mais na.
Narinig na po ako.
Oo, sige. Go ahead.
Okay. Sige po. Magandang hapon po sa lahat at nabigyan kami sa pakisama ng pagkakataon na maging bahagi nitong sama-aralan na iugit ng ating mga tagapagsalita na kung saan ay nakakapanganib yung nakakatakot yung porsyento ng mga bansot sa ating kabataan ngayon. Pero gusto ko po, bukod doon sa mga nasabi ng ating mga tagapagsalita, merong ilan na baka mainam ding tingnan. Dahil halimbawa, advocate po kasi yung pakisama ng agrarian reform and rural development. Kaya yung mungkahi ni Sir kanina na itaas yung retained area sa agrarian reform na 25 to 30 hectares ay sa kabilang bahagi po tingin naman namin sa bahagi namin hindi mainam yun para sa amin dahil meron pa yung agrarian reform, may natitira pa po yung mahigit 500,000 hectares ng dapat ipamahagi sa mga magsasaka. Ang dahilan din baka hindi yung laki ng lupa ang galawin natin, sa halip ay i-clusterize natin yung mga magsasaka na halimbawa kung kailangan ng mag-produce ng sugar, so may cluster na para sa sugar. Halimbawa kung kinakailangan itong rice ay maparami, merong cluster talaga para sa rice. At ito yung hindi ko maintindihan po mga katoto dahil matagal nang umiiral itong kakulangan sa bigas hanggang ngayon ay hindi pa nasusolusyonan ng pamahalaan. Sa halip ay nag-import pa tayo at sinasabi nung presyo ng bigas, Pero pag inaral mo ngayon, hindi naabot yung pangako na yun . Mas mataas pa nga yung bigas ngayon, nasa 40 plus, samantalang ang pangako ng RTL ay mapababa siya hanggang 28 pesos per kilo man lang o mas mababa pa doon. Pero hindi po natin yun naabot at dahil dito patuloy po yung importasyon natin. Gusto ko pong ipaliwanag sa mga kasama na kami, kahit po kami mga magsasaka ng palay, kami po ay consumer din. Kasi ang dahilan, kapag po kami nag-ani dahil sa kakulangan naman ng mga post-harvest facility, kung tag-ulan yan, obligado kaming ibenta kahit mga presyo natin sa merkado. Kasi wala nga kaming patuyo. Ngayon, pagkatapos naming maibenta, bibili ulit kami ng bigas pagkatapos ng anihan. At yun, kaya namin ginagawa yun para makabayad din kami ng aming mga pagkakautang dahil mula sa binhi hanggang pataba naman ay binibili na ngayon. Hindi katulad ng araw na yung aming binhi, naghihingian lang kami sa magkakapitbahay. Ngayon yung mga binhi ay negosyo na rin eh. Pero mga multinational company na nagpo-produce na talaga ng binhi at sinasabing mahusay. Pero ito naman ay suportado dapat ng mga fertilizer, pesticide at iba pa at saka patubig. So, yun po yung malaking dahilan ng pag-atras ng agrikultura. Pangatlo siguro itong climate change na binabaka natin ngayon. Pagka nakaulan ay talaga namang baha at pag bumagyo ay back to zero yung mga magsasaka at walang inaani. Yung tungkol doon sa budget, totoo yung sinasabi nila sir mali yung paggamit ng budget. At katunayan halimbawa, itong sa sibuyas, pag inaral natin yon, mahigit 50% ng storage ng magsisibuyas ay nasa Maynila, nasa NCR. Wala rin sa lugar kung saan sila nagsasaka. Kaya ang nangyayari, mauobliga silang ibenta yung kanilang produkto sa mas mababang presyo. At dahil dito, nalulugi rin yung mga magsasaka. Pag nalugi po kasi yung mga magsasaka, nawawala ng ganang magsaka. Halimbawa ngayon, mura ang bigas, mura ang palay. At dahil sa pagmura ng palay, mas maraming magsasaka ang hindi na nagtatanim ng palay. Ibig sabihin nun, nagbabanta tayo sa kakulangan sa pagkain. Sa palay pa lamang yon. Kasi ako po ay pamprobinsiyang pangulo ng Irrigators Association at marami nagsasabi na hindi sila nagtanim dahil sa nalulugi sila sa pagtatanim ng palay. Dahil dito, bantayan sa pagkain. Yung isa pa siguro, baka mainam na yung suporta ay tuwiran talaga sa mga magsasaka. Maraming pagtitingnan natin yung magsasaka ngayon, yung statistic niya, 58 na halos yung edad 57, 58. At walang sumusunod na susunod sa kanilang magsasaka dahil yung mga kabataan ngayon ayaw nang magsaka dahil sa karanasan ng kanilang mga magulang na lugi sa pagsasaka. Kaya mahalagang hamon nito na gawin natin kapaki-pakinabang yung mga magsasaka at pakinabang sana ngayon yung mga magsasaka para maipakita rin sa mga kabataan na may kita sa pagsasaka at pwede kang makapagpaaral, makapagpadamit at makapagpabahay sa iyo ng maayos para sa kinabukasan ng iyong mga anak. Kapag hindi ganyan yung mukha ng agrikultura natin ngayon, ay papalubog yung ating agrikultura. At mahirap namang isaalang-alang o iasa yung ating sikmura sa ibang bansa. Totoong maayos yung importasyon dahil available yung pagkain. Pero ang tanong ay kaya ba ng mga mamamayan na bumili ng pagkain? Yun yung isang tanong. At kapag nagkaroon ng crisis doon, kunyari yung China, nasalanta yung kanilang trigo. Siyempre, atrasyon. Katulad ng Ukraine, sila yung nagpo-produce ng maraming trigo. Ginera ngayon, kaya nagmamahal ngayon yung mga tinapay na mangyayari rin sa trigo. Kaya mahalagang tingnan din ito sa pagdaloy ng panahon. Kasi kung ganito ang agrikultura natin, medyo mahirap tayong makaahon. Yung supply halimbawa ng gatas, merong mga pag-aaral ako nakita na kapag yung nyug, meron din siyang gatas. At mas mainam na yun ang gawin na mas marami tayo nyug sa Pilipinas kaysa mag-import tayo ng baka galing sa Australia para lang mag-produce ng dairy product. At marami pang iba na mahalagang naaaral at napapaunlad natin yung full value chain ng mga produktong pang-agrikultura. Dahil hindi lang naman bigas yung pagkain natin. Meron tayong root crops, meron tayong kunyari ay itong sorghum, may mais tayo, meron tayong import ng pag-import natin. Kasi pag nalulugi yung mga magsasaka, nawawalan silang ganang magsaka dahil nalulugi nga. Pangatlo siguro sa mga pulisiya rin. Tingnan natin yung mga pulisiya na katulad binabanggit ni Sir Jude kanina. Totoo yun na nangyayari sa kanayunan. At mahalagang ito ay masolusyonan ng ating pamahalaan sa iba't ibang pamamaraan ng pagtugon. Yan lang po siguro at maraming salamat.
Okay, sige, maraming salamat, Kevin. Okay, sige. Before we go to the question and answer portion, and I think before we actually started this webinar, we already we already got several questions no, from the participants no, and I can go through them. No. Pero bago siguro tayo magsimula, baka Doc Fermin or Doc Shell, you might want to respond, or even Ms. Ekchud, they want to respond to some of the points that our reactors ask, no? Particular the points raised by Karen, and una nga yung about the land retention, instead of maybe increasing the land ownership limit, maybe looking into possibly clustering or even corporatizing that. And then how do you balance now the issue of lower tariffs, no? Given that there are also issues in terms of food supply that's happening all over the world. No? For example, I think Karen has cited yung issue nga ng Ukraine.
Siguro magsimula ako.
Sige, Doc Chair, you want to start?
Yeah, totoo yun na ang napakahalagang hakbang para nga yung malutas yung problema natin sa fragmented farm structure. Talagang humanap tayo ng paraan na makapag-consolidate ang mga maliliit na farms, ano? And this is the reason why, lagi ko nga pinapoint out, tingnan nyo ang Thailand. Anong pangalan ng kanilang Ministry of Agriculture? Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives. Na talagang nakita ng pamahalaan ng Thailand na kooperatiba ang talagang ang central program dapat sa agriculture. Na yun mismo ang pangalan ng kanilang ministry itself. Tayo talagang yung history natin sa cooperatives, bakit nga ba kokonti daw ang mga nagtatagumpay na cooperative. Of course, ang mga malimit na storya, tinakbo yung pera, hindi maganda yung leadership. Siguro yan tutukan natin. And for that reason, isa sa mga recommendations itong mga kasama ko sa Los Baños, itong Coalition for Agricultural Modernization in the Philippines. Ibalik natin yung Bureau of Agriculture Cooperatives Development sa DA na inabolish nung ginawa yung Cooperatives Development Authority. Akala nila magduduplicate. Sa totoo lang, inaamin ng mismo taga-CDA na hindi nila kaya yung developmental function. Ang kaya lang nila yung regulatory function na pag-checklist ng mga requirements sa pagbuo ng co-op. Yun ang paborito nilang gawin. So walang developmental work. Kaya malimit, tama yung sinabi ni Dr. Fermin na regulasyon ang paborito ng mga tao sa pamahalaan, hindi yung development. And in short, if we had the DA really focusing on cooperatives development as a very core function, then siguro hindi na natin kailangan increase ng retention limit. Although yun nga, ang argument kasi diyan, sa ngayon kailangan natin na investment sa agribusiness, sa agricultural processing, lalo na napag-iwanan tayo sa exports ng agricultural products. So siguro dapat sabayan, parallel, tulad sa Thailand. May malalaki, pero matagumpay din sila sa pagka-cluster into cooperatives and nucleus estates.
I will add to that yung kay Shell from this basis na actually nung panahon ni Secretary Dar, he pushed hard for the clustering and consolidation. That's one of the pillars na niya na pinush hard. Ang diferensya nga is that we don't have again we don't have control over the extension workers sa LGU level. So you have to be able to relate to the LGUs and tell them this is important. And the problem is aggravated by the fact that people tend to think that it's always the government and the state that will have solutions to their problems. I mean, Pakisama is a big organization. Why don't you form your own cooperative? And you can access a lot of assistance. I think Edilia ng NIA, mayor siya dun sa PIDIG, he did that. And several others did that because it's much easier for you to get assistance from different organizations, not only government, but even multilateral, bilateral, because that's their favorite area to provide support. Ang problema is that it's not just the government that should be doing the job. It should be you, the NGO, civil society. In fact, I was challenging my friends in Ateneo. Why don't you do a lot of cooperatives? Why don't you organize them? If you are so interested in really people empowerment, sabi nga ni Shell, it has to be a job for everybody, not just for the government. Secondly, yung rice, ang problema talaga natin, the population growth, and we have limited lands, fertile lands for cultivation, our population growth simply outpaced the agricultural productivity growth. Let me cite you an example. In the 1970s, when I was still in UP, late o mid-70s, ang population ng Pilipinas, 45 million. Ang land size natin, 300,000 square kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, or 30 million hectares. We have the same, ang Thailand had the same population, but it has 50 million hectares of land. Ibig sabihin, halos doble ng size natin ng Thailand. At flat land, ano pa yan, contiguous area. You know what's the population of Thailand? Thailand's population is only 70 million. Our population is 110, 112 million. So no matter what you do in terms of pure technical side, it's not because of the technical side, it's the sheer volume of people that we keep on reproducing every year. Diba? So you have to look at that with limited land size. So I was looking at the projection ni Yusek Sebastian, who's now the Undersecretary for Rice. Ang taas na naman yung population growth. So how are you going to address that? And besides the fact that money, I mean resources, economic resources, particularly money, they're not like manna falling from heaven. Hindi naman libre lahat yan, ano? There are scarce resources. Sinabi nga ni Kapag na, okay, bakit hindi yung adlay? Bakit hindi yung sorghum, etc. But when you talk to the technical people, yeah, it's possible. But the expenses, ano, yung cost of producing that will be very high. So ganun may limits yung technology, limited by the budgetary resources you have. You have to take all of this into consideration. Okay, consolidation and clustering are really fine. And then I was talking to Nueva Ecija, one of those. Ang problem talaga na somehow in our cultural setup, pag nag-away daw yung misis, yung magsasaka, na magka-neighbor, ayaw nang magkasama. So those are the problems, daily problems that you have to encounter when you're organizing. And I think it is best for the LGUs and the civil society organization to take that as a challenge. Why don't you participate in establishing and forming and strengthening cooperatives in the country? Thank you.
Sige, thank you, Dr. Bin. And maybe the second point that I think Ateneo is balancing, which actually also was touched also in the presentation of Dr. Shell earlier, that food security is not equal to food's sufficiency. But the question now is, how do you do the balance? Given we see maybe geopolitical conflicts or maybe climate change that might affect food supply in the future, especially though.
Meron lang ginagawa dyan. Sa rice may ginagawa. I mean, Yusek Sebastian has done that in Vietnam, itong climate resilient rice production. At least for rice, there are already plans being formulated by Yusek to do it early planting season. Okay? But importante dyan, you have to talk to NIA to provide the water supply during the dry season. So you have to coordinate closely. So that if you plant now or something like earlier, you will avoid the destructive typhoons during the latter part of the year. May mga ganon. Of course, there are also flood resilient kind of. May technology tayo dyan. The only problem that we have is we don't really put dedicated people in that concern. As I've made in my presentation, wala tayong tao sa Climate Resilient Office ng Agriculture except for the director. Siya lang ang regular. Wala pong plantilla position sa kanila. So just like for example, you're talking about PCA, you want yung replanting. That means you have to have a lot of reproduction of seedlings materials. Do you know how many people that we have plant breeders sa PCA? Less than 3. 2 or 3 people, the plant breeders. So I think we can. This is the I think this is the point that I'm trying to make. It is so easy to come out with ideas. It is so easy to come out with beautiful concepts, but in the organization, on the ground, etc., then that's the real challenge. Real challenges will come in. Yung execution side, ang hirap talaga. Kasi ibang klase. That's the reason why I encourage you to go to government so that you will be, you will see the problems. For example, we were trying to produce. Let's have crop diversification in rice. Rice-based crop. You are being challenged in the DBM that you put money for other crops in the rice program. It's not allowed. And the high value crops people will be challenging you. Why is the money for high value crops going to rice and not to us? Those are the kinds of things. PCIC, okay. I had battles with these guys and Bipar, no, inside. PCIC, more than half of their people are contractuals on job orders. And they are the ones doing actual ocular inspection. Just imagine, contractuals, how can you determine that what they're doing is really right in terms of particular? So we tried to introduce satellite technology. They resisted it because those 2,000 employees will lose their jobs. So madali talaga sabihin, sir, madali talaga. I guess what I'm saying is that be involved, get into the bureaucracy, and you will see whether your ideas or concepts can be operational. And I think that's the beauty of it. What we need, or probably concepts, wala na tayo, Shell, we have the same concept. What we need are good managers in the bureaucracy, dedicated managers. We need to recruit more people like that and who really has the nation in their interests. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Min. And maybe I don't know if the point nga of the institutional reforms and what Dr. Shell earlier said about provincializing maybe agriculture might also address that. So I don't.
Other thing, for example, yung coconut levy, it's not moving at
expound
all.
on this a little bit.
It's not moving. The 75 billion is not moving. Why? Because of the wrong structural arrangement that was made, because they were all distributed to different agencies the money. Without those agencies asking money for DBM, without coming their own proposals, it cannot be spent. And that's the reason. And most of those agencies have their own priorities also. So nasa last bottom yung priorities sa coconut. So it's not moving at all.
Nauna po kasi
See?
yung karetela sa kalabaw diyan sa coconut levy.
Hindi ko nag-move. Wala.
Okay.
What you need there is
Maybe,
like a park. Okay. I'll stop, sorry.
I mean, to try to implement. Yeah, if the issue really is informed. So given all of what you've said, parang what's maybe the best way to either legislate or implement them? So I don't know, si Doc Shell, I mean, you're talking about earlier about devolution. You were talking about microeconomic reforms, on insurance. So how do we actually implement or even legislate them?
Well, tulad ng sinabi ko, talagang probinsya the provinces have to step up, and that means DA must also take responsibility for capacitating the provinces. Like I said, ilagay yan sa KRA nila na tinitingnan din ng DBM. When they are asked at the end of the year about their performance, one of the questions they need to be asked is, are our provincial governments do they have a better capacity now to supervise agricultural development, so that you do not try to do it top down, which, as we all know, can be disastrous, like the anecdote I told about that barangay. So siguro pag talagang tulong-tulong, and I like to say that agriculture is too important to leave to the DA alone. It has to be a partnership, especially with LGUs, but of course private sector, farmers groups, academe, civil society. Magtulong-tulungan natin dapat lahat yan. Kaya lang dapat bukas din ng DA na makipag-partnership sa lahat na yan. And by the way, the bonus of working through the LGUs, like I said, is yung absorptive capacity nila tataas. Kung pwede nilang ipasa na lang sa probinsya, kayo ang magsabi kung ano kailangan dyan. Hindi kami magpipilit ng fertilizer at hybrid seed kung di yun ang kailangan muna. Pero alam niyo ang problema, they are the closest to the ground, the LGUs. Let them determine how to spend the money. But merong adequate safeguards on these resources that will be downloaded to the LGU. So in short, that's the way to get a bigger budget for agriculture. Na alam natin kulang na kulang. At of course, para maganda din ang paggamit, ang isang napaka-importanting gamit yung pagpapatibay ng kapasidad ng mga probinsya natin na i-manage yung agriculture nila through the municipal offices.
Randy, one point lang. I think merong cross-cutting approach. To be pragmatic, we should try all of these ideas. May pros and cons ang bawat idea. Halimbawa, working with LGUs, I work with LGUs, but very short ang planning horizon ng LGUs. They would like very visible projects na very short on gestation. Culture might not be like that. Pero yung co-financing between national and local, that might really work kasi longer ang planning horizon ng national. But at the core, I think as new ideas are proposed, siguro the best way to go is do parallel experiments, try all these ideas, but be sure that we have a solid evaluation of these ideas, not just at the end, but as they are implemented. Yun din ang kailangan budgetan.
Yeah.
At doon kailangan tumulong pala yung academe, by the way.
Yeah, if I may add, I think it's high time to review the local government code. I think the democracy in this country has been defined in terms of numbers. That the candidate who get the most number of voters wins. But democracy in this country has not emphasized the important feature of democracy, which is accountability. That among the different regimes, it's only the democratic regime that makes the government accountable. Pero wala doon sa local government code or something like that. There is no accountability mechanism. In fact, even national politicians natin. I think tama yun. We need to review LGC code to make to put in accountability measures which can be evaluated, as Jude said, by monitoring evaluations, and let's reward those who are performing, and then somehow scold or whatever those who are not performing. I think that is very important. Make politicians accountable. If we don't, then I think democracy becomes half meaningless or practically meaningless.
Sige, thank you very much. No, I know it's already 5 o'clock, and we promised that you and the participants of this Zoom that the webinar will end at around that time. So we have 2 to 3 pages more questions, but I don't know if it will take us maybe an hour or more to tackle to them. So what maybe we'll do is to, so if you can, still address them by sending them to you, and you can answer them. But anyway, what I'll just do in the end is just to ask each of you maybe to just give a closing statement towards the end. Might want to also highlight further the points that you raised in your presentation, or there's some of the questions that are that have been also put forward also in the by Karen and also Crystal, our reactors. So maybe just
I can
closing statements.
Just 1 minute or so. I think if you look at the successful countries, the developed countries, there are 2 most important things that they look at, because this is an investment to the future. One is the education of their people. The second is really the nutrition of their people, the well-being. These are the ultimate objectives of development. The rest are just supportive of these 2 developments. Education, because it is important that kids, like for example, if you look at Singapore, they really heavily invest in education because that's the future of the country. That makes this country strong. And then they look at the food requirements, nutritional level, but because that is supportive of their education. Without looking at that, we will never develop as a country. I don't think you go Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, etc., even China, they heavily invested in those 2. I think we need to pay attention to that, even if it's long-term. Politicians do not think long-term, but us who are in the academic field should continue reminding them that these are the ultimate development goals for our people and for the country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sa akin naman, I will just go back to one thing I said about agriculture. Siguro, kung meron tayong education commission na magtatalakayin talaga, at there will be multi-sectoral consultations there. In fact, nagsisimula na finally na mag-meeting yung mga iba-ibang sangayon yung education commission. Sana magbuo din tayo ng agriculture commission kasi kailangan natin pagsama-samahan mga utak natin dito eh. Hindi maaaring ang solusyon na sa atin lang mga supposedly madudunong dito. Hindi eh. Kailangan pakinggan natin din yung all the way, the whole cross-section of society, how we should move forward on agriculture. So let's do an EDCOM style approach to agriculture. I hope Congress takes heed and organizes this multi-sectoral way of planning our way forward in agriculture. Siguro pag kasundo-sundo tayo sa direksyon, yun, malulutas natin yung isang problema about lack of teamwork. Sabi nga ni FBR, lack of UST, lack of unity, solidarity, and teamwork. And siguro, ang pinakamaganda, hanapin natin yung paraan para nagkakaisa tayo sa ating approach sa agrikultura. Yun lang.
Thank you, Dr. I think that's something that this group working on the webinar and maybe the Ateneo can also tackle of organizing or advocating the Agricultural Commission. Sige, Sec June.
Ako para sa mga kabataan, siguro yung mga kabataan, I would not expect them to go to the farms, not yet anyway, but maybe they should go into the cold storage business. Maybe they could go to the crop insurance business to bring in the private sector and to identify the kind of support that's needed to induce the private sector and entrepreneurial talent to come into these other segments of the value chain that would ultimately make farm production a good business too.
So that's the important point that agriculture is not only crop production, but also the support services that are and that's where we need also management expertise. So thanks again, the participants in the Zoom to give our speakers and also our reactors a warm round of applause to the points that they provided us. The discussion has been, the presentations and discussion have been very excellent, as also shown in the chat, in the Zoom. So thank you very much, Dr. Shell, Dr. Fermin, Yusek, and also our reactors, si Karene and also Crystal, for gracing this webinar. Again, a very comprehensive presentation that has been made this afternoon, but I guess we have heard a lot of very good points on the overview made by Dr. Fermin, the overview of the agriculture sector, the causes of the problems in the sector, and also some recommendations, and which were also reiterated. Some of these causes were also reiterated by Dr. Shell, and also some directions as well. And Dr. Shell certainly highlighted the point of the difference between the issue of food security and also food sufficiency. And we also heard from Yusek Jude about some of the recommendations that can be undertaken in terms of micro issues in the agriculture sector. So with that, we'd like to again thank them for all the presentations and the discussion that was responses that they made in the discussion afterwards. So with that, I'd like just to call as the country director of the SDSN, Eman Delocado, to also show the certificates of recognition of our speakers this afternoon. So we'll be acknowledging our speakers to.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So certificate of appreciation is presented to for his valuable contribution as a resource person to the Securing Food Availability, Sustainability, and Access webinar of the SDG2 project.
Certificates of
Policy and Governance of Sustainable Food Systems webinar series, given this first day of March 2023 via Zoom and PH SDG2 Zero Hunger, Roel Ravanera, Executive Director, Xavier Science Foundation, and Rizalino Rivera, Vice President for Mission Integration at Ateneo de Manila University. Thank you again, Dr. Habito, Dr. Adriano, and Mr. Seguera. And also, we thank our reactors, Ms. Crystal Ras and Karen Cirillo. Maraming salamat po. At this point, we would like to invite you to the different activities of SDSN Philippines and SDG2 project. This webinar is the first in the series called Policy and Governance of Sustainable Food Systems. We received a lot of questions and comments, which we hope we can address in the succeeding webinars. If you feel like there's more to this topic that we should unpack, it's because this is just the first dive on the topic of policy and governance for sustainable food systems. We hope that you will join us in the next one, such as the May 3 webinar on social protection and safety nets for the different actors of food systems. The next ones rather, on public health, biodiversity, and food waste also highlight how food security issue is a systems and a multidisciplinary issue. We also invite you to join our Facebook page, our Facebook group, Food Systems Community Dialogues. So this is a group where enthusiasts on the food systems and concerned individuals can learn more about food systems in general. This is a platform also wherein we can hear more about upcoming activities as well as to network with other enthusiasts and experts in food systems. Aside from this, SDSN Philippines and the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability have other upcoming events. Together with GRI and the John Gokongwei School of Management, we will have a public plenary entitled The Evolving Role of Universities in Sustainability on March 13. We will delve into the question on how have the industry and corporate sectors adjusting, how have they been adjusting due to the global inclination towards sustainability? And how are the universities adjusting to this trend as well? Students and professionals alike can learn a lot from this discussion. It is a hybrid event, therefore you can attend via Zoom or may attend on-site at the Ateneo de Manila University, but pre-registration for on-site attendees is required by the end of this week. Now, an event designed for high school and college students, Incubating Sustainable Solutions, which will be on April 19. This is an international collaboration between SDSN Philippines, SDSN Hong Kong, and SDSN Thailand. We will feature speakers from the three networks who will inspire the youth to become champions on sustainability. And lastly, not an event, but an announcement. In a very special way, we wish to thank Mr. Vixon Visperas, who helped us in the previous activities of SDG2 Zero Hunger Project, SDSN Philippines, and the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. Vixon, we wish you well in your next chapter. At this point, we would like to invite those who are capable to turn on their camera for our commemorative group photo.
Okay, kindly turn on your cameras, please, if possible. And please hold your smiles for a while as there are 8 slides that we'll be going through. I'll just say at which slide I'm at as I take it, okay? Okay, 1, 2, 3 out of 8. 4 out of 8. 5 out of 8. 6 out of 8. 7 out of 8. And then last slide. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Javi, and thank you, Dr. Tuanyo, for moderating this session. We would like to invite you to answer the evaluation form. If the link is posted in the chat and is flashed on the screen. Okay, certificates of participation will be issued to those who will accomplish the evaluation form. Thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.